Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in March of 2023. So yesterday or the day before, depending on when I get it out, I wrapped up all the books that I read for the readathon Around the World in 80 Days. I do want to wrap up in this video also March the Mammoths, which I read 4 books for, which was very impressive for me. And then I'll get to all the other books, all the random books that I read this month. In total, I read 14 books this month, 7 of which were on my physical TBR. So, and a few of those were actually quite long books, so I'm happy with how many long books I got through. And I have not figured out the stats for this month of my reading from my physical TBR, but you know what? 7 books means I am down to 97 books, which means I am under 100 books on my physical TBR, which makes me very happy. So first, let's get to the books that I read for the March of the Mammoths. So if you don't know, the March of the Mammoths is this event hosted every single year, and it's all about reading books that are very, very long. I think the minimum page count is 700. All of the books that I read are over 700. So the first book I read for that was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and this one was like 1,200 pages, very dense, and I did a full complete review on my channel if you would like to listen to my full thoughts. But basically, I enjoyed it. I think it's a lot better than The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, which I read last month, but I still don't agree with certain of her philosophies. I think she understood some things. For example, she came from Soviet Russia, so she saw that a lot of government control was not a good thing. But she also idealizes capitalists as if they were gods or saints and they couldn't do evil, when I see all humans as having a propensity towards evil, and we kind of need to fight against that and not be selfish. So she almost painted everything as like black and white, where I think there's some gray involved. So I agreed with her maybe 50%, but I think in certain ways she went too far, and I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. The next mammoth I read was Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, and I want to just thank my subscribers for letting me know this before I started it, because it really helped me get through this book. They gave me a trigger warning, I guess, that there is a lot of violence towards women in this book, and I think I would have struggled with that a lot more if I hadn't been prepared for that going in. So thank you guys. My subscribers are amazing. So this book follows a group of individuals who are trying to construct a cathedral in, I believe it's the 1200s. There's a lot of change of power. One king dies. There's 2 different kings or queens that are like vying for power. So there's a lot going on in this medieval era. It's a very dense book. There's a lot of characters. Prior Philip is amazing. He's my favorite character. Even if he's not perfect, even if I don't agree with all his rationale, he is the one that is driving the building of the cathedral. You also have Tom, and he is the architect and main builder, and his family is involved. So the good things about this book, I really enjoyed just the details of how the world is created. Every character is interesting. Not that I enjoyed every character, but every character is very nuanced, and I enjoyed that. I also feel like a lot of stuff is balanced very well in this book, whether it's the politics, the more action scenes with the more like gentle scenes. I think the church in some ways is depicted very much as a political entity and less of a spiritual entity, even with Prior Philip, who I would think is probably the most holy person in this book. He is very much depicted as being a rational individual with little spiritual side. So he has the forefront of spirituality without the in-depth philosophy of being spiritual, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but so this author is not religious at all. And I think that comes forward in the book because you don't have a lot of nuance on the spirituality and the religion that I am used to in reading more like religious texts. For example, The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni that I read a couple months ago. That one really gets in depth in the psychology and spirituality of how like religion changes your outlook on life. And I think he missed that in this book, but also I'm not going to complain because it was a very well written book. Here's what ruined this book for me. And personally, why I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars as opposed to like 3 or 4 at least. The unnecessary fixation on a woman's body. Don't get me wrong. I think that having graphic content in a book sometimes lends itself to touching the reader. So for example, there is a graphic assault scene of a woman in here. It's pretty horrific to read, but it's very imperative to the characters involved. Like, it affects their behavior for the rest of the book. And so while I didn't like that scene, I could appreciate that it fit in the book. But the majority of scenes like that, and it's like practically every single chapter, the fixation on a woman's body, especially on more of her intimate areas, like her chest. It's always commented on by every character. It's like this author has a fixation on it. And it really detracted from the book for me. Like, I don't care if you're talking about a girl's boobs every 5 pages. I don't want it. I don't care. I want to get back to the medieval stuff, okay? So I felt like that really downgraded my liking of this book because I think it was unnecessary. If it added to the plot, if it was like one specific character, like there is a horrible individual, the main antagonist of this book, and he does fixate a little bit on a woman's body. If I'm like, if that's just his personality, then I would have no problem with it. But it's every male character except for Prior Philip, which is the reason why I liked him, because he doesn't do that. But everyone else was like, oh, this girl's so hot, like in medieval terminology. And I was so over it by the end. I hated that inclusion, and it really downgraded the enjoyment I had for this book. So I think there is an audience for this book, and I can see why it's so popular, but I will not be continuing on in the series. So yeah, I'm glad I read it though, because I've been wanting to read it for a long time. All right, the third book I read for the March of the Mammoths was The Search for Modern China by Jonathan D. Spence. And mostly it focuses on the 1600s in China all the way to the modern era, more like Mao's regime, 1960s. I enjoyed like the history up until the end of the 1900s, and then I found it not as interesting near the end of the book. I will say I was a little bit annoyed by, I would say the first half or less of the book discusses the first, I'd say 300s, from 1600 up to 1900. Like that's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is just entirely on the 20th century. So the 1900 up to like 1960. So you have 60 years being discussed in half this book and like 300 years in the first half. And I think it could have gotten more into the beginning history a little bit more. I understand it's in search of modern China. So I understand why it was included, but I found it less interesting to focus so much on the 19th century or 20th century and not really focus as much on the earlier history of China. But that's also because I prefer the earlier history of China, so it might be a me problem. I did end up giving it 4 out of 5 stars though, so I did enjoy it. I think it's a really good reference, and I will be referencing it if I write books set around these eras in history, in Chinese history specifically. All right, and the last the last mammoth I read for March of the Mammoths was the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This is my bajillionth book by Charles Dickens. I feel like every time I read another one of his books, I'm like, surely I'm coming to the end of his books. But no, he has so many of them. But this book is not going to go into my favorites as Charles Dickens' book, but it was good. It was fun. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, I think. So it follows Mr. Pickwick, who is this middle-aged gentleman, and he forms this like British London gentlemen's club of these eccentric individuals, and they like travel around England and have adventures, and some of them get married, some of them end up making some bad choices. It's very fun. It's like light, even though it does deal with like heavier topics, like marriage, like poverty in England. It's handled in a very light way that I think this is one of the lightest by Charles Dickens I have read. Many of his books go much darker than this one. And so it was fun read. It was fun, but I did find that, the adventures they have along the way, while they do come to a conclusion at the end of the book, and I enjoyed the end, I found that it was meandering just a little bit in the plot and narrative, and different ones of Charles Dickens' different books do it better, where they focus more on a main narrative while having the length be this length or longer. So I don't think it's one of his strongest works, but I enjoyed it. It's a fun read. It's hilarious at points. So there are all the books that I read for the March the Mammoths. I enjoyed that, and I'm glad to get some very long Mammoths off my physical TBR, because 3 out of 4 of the Mammoths I read outside of Atlas Shrugged, I had on my TBR for years. So excited to get that out. So now let's get to all the books, all the other random books that I read for this month. I started off the month with the Singapore Sapphire. This was for Around the World in 80 Days by A.M. Stewart. It was a very fun, cozy mystery set in 1910 Singapore. So you have it under occupation by Britain. So you have conflict between the Singaporean people made up of the Chinese, the Malay people, the Indian people, some. So you have a lot of locals versus more of the British imperialists, the people who were the ruling power in Singapore. Really interesting book, murder mystery, light and fun, but then you also had deeper things that were discussed. I would highly recommend it if you like cozy historical mysteries like I do. Then for Lent, I actually had a few books on my TBR to read, and the first one was Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. This is a medieval text kind of discussing how to live a holy life. I really enjoyed it. I think the main overarching theme that was discussed in this book is humility. Don't be prideful. Don't live your life thinking only of yourself. Think of others. Think of those you care about. Think of your family, and see yourself as imperfect and try to perfect yourself. And it doesn't mean putting yourself down, but it means saying, yes, I have, anger issues, for example. I need to work on them. That doesn't necessarily mean I am pure evil because I have these anger issues. It just means that none of us are perfect, and we all kind of have to work on ourselves and make ourselves better in order to be happier. So it was a great book. I highly recommend it if you are into theology or philosophy, whether you are Christian or not. I think this is a great book. And then for the Black Hearts Book Club, hosted by Very Literary Carrie, I read The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. And this one was a noir mystery. I believe it was written in the 20s or 30s. It's about Sam Spade, who has this mysterious woman approach him and say, hey, I need your help with this situation. Then he and his partner get involved. His partner gets murdered, and Sam Spade gets pulled into this whole conspiracy, including this Maltese Falcon, the main thing that everybody wants in this book. So here's the thing. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, so I didn't hate the book. I thought it was decently good. It was a nice noir mystery, but it was very, very stylized. So the characters were stylized. Sam Spade is very much a caricature of this noir detective, as opposed to a real person. And I would have liked to see more into his head, his rationale as to how he came to certain conclusions, because we'd be traveling along in this adventure, and he would have figured something out 20 to 30 pages ago, and just reveal it way later, and you would be like, oh, he was thinking that? I would have liked to know that he was thinking that earlier on. And so certain things were kept from the reader that I thought were unnecessary to keep from the reader, but for the most part, it was a fun noir mystery, and it's one that I've been wanting to read for a long time, so I enjoyed it. Next book I read was China, Dawn of a Golden Age, 200 to 750 by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Basically, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is in New York City, and they had a exhibit where quite a lot of early Chinese art and figurines and things were on display. And this book would have been sold at the museum when that exhibit was on display. And then people visiting the museum could buy this book and say, hey, I remember going to see this. Obviously, I didn't go to the exhibit, but it was very cool cool because it has everything that would have been in the exhibit pictured here, and it goes through what everything was. And I really enjoyed that because as someone who obviously wasn't able to go to the exhibit, so see it says 260, 161, and then 162 here, basically talking about the different features of the exhibit. For somebody like me who wasn't able to go to this exhibit, obviously, it was very enjoyable to like see all the different artifacts we have of that era in history. The first section of the book is a few essays on that history, so you get kind of an overview of what was exactly the Tang and the Sui and the Han dynasties, things like that. But then you also have the individual items that are later on in this book. I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I love the art and I enjoyed just looking through art books. Then also for Around the World in 80 Days, for my Japan pick, I picked The Rising Sun, The Decline and Fall of the Japanese Empire from 1936 to 1945 by John Toland. I talked about this in my wrap-up a couple days ago more thoroughly. But basically, I enjoyed this. This is only the first volume. Unfortunately, it is not the complete text, so it doesn't go to the very end of the war. But I enjoyed this book, but I found that it was a little bit too narrative, almost fictionalized based, creative nonfiction, as opposed to based on what we actually know. But it was really interesting to see the perspective of the Japanese, because so often we look at World War II from the perspective of the West, but to actually see the rationale of why the Japanese were doing what they were doing was very interesting. And I think that's important to look at perspectives. Same thing with Nazis in Nazi Germany. In order to keep history from repeating itself, you kind of have to look back and say, well, what were they thinking that led them on this path to violence and destruction? And so then we don't go on that path, because that would be bad to have another World War II. Even though it will probably happen. World War III is probably going to happen. It's very sad. All right, and then I read Kirkland Revels by Victoria Holt. I needed a nice light book, and this one was so much fun. It was more heavy on the mystery than most of hers. It was very light on the romance. It follows this young woman, Catherine, I think her name was. She meets this dog and this young man, and the young man befriends her and falls in love with her. Even though she enjoys his company, she doesn't love him, but he proposes to her, and she decides, because he says, yeah, I have a weak heart, I'm probably going to die soon. She's like, okay, I'm going to marry him a little bit out of pity. And so she goes to his home, which is called Kirkland Revels, which is like this gothic, massive house that's out in the English countryside. And she finds that there are secrets in the house and things happen and there's a murder and she has to solve it. So while there is some romance in this book, predominantly it is a mystery, and I really enjoyed it. The only thing is that in these gothic romance, the protagonists tend to be very like all the same. They tend to very much fit stereotypes, which isn't necessarily bad, because you're focusing on the gothic atmosphere and the mystery, which was done very well in this book. But Catherine's character itself was very bland in a sense, but I really loved this book. It was a great book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. There we go. All right, and then the next 3 books I actually read were for Around the World in 80 Days. So I read The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, which I did not enjoy. I talked about it in my wrap-up a couple days ago, but this one was about a family prior to the Great Depression living in the Deep South, and I just found that things were not said a lot and everything wasn't clear. So you had something happen and I was like, is that what happened? But you didn't actually know. You had things hinted at as maybe this happened, but you don't know. So wasn't a huge fan of this book. I do want to read more of William Faulkner's books in the future to see if it's just this book or if he's just not the author for me. Next book I read was Murder in an Irish Village by Carleen O'Connor, and this one was great fun. It's about this family of 6 kids whose parents were killed in a drunk driving accident a year before, and the brother of the person who was accused of being the drunk driver comes forward a year later and says, hey, my brother didn't do it, he's innocent, and that person gets murdered. And so, of course, these 6 siblings, including the main character, Siobhan, she has to solve the case with the help of her 5 younger siblings. It's great fun, and I really loved like a lot of the Irish certain phrases that were used. I really adored the book, and I look forward to reading more in this series. It was just a light, cozy mystery, and I really needed it after a lot of the March of the Mammoth books. The next book that I read, the last book that I read for Around the World in 80 Days was Pavilion of Women by Pearl S. Buck. Liked it, didn't love it. I loved, it follows this young woman, who is turning 40, and she runs this household where she has 4 sons and daughter-in-laws and things like that. And she, so it's about a very changing time in Chinese history. You have it set just prior to Japanese invasion of China. There's a lot going on. I enjoyed the setting and seeing behind the walls of like a very traditional Chinese household. But also she meets this excommunicated priest, this priest who is spiritual but doesn't really believe in a religion. And it's really bizarre. It was like cultish, some of the stuff that like she has a spiritual awakening without having any like rational understanding of it. It's quite bizarre. Didn't like that aspect. So some of this book was good, but it went in a weird direction I did not like. So 3 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read was also for my Lent books that I was hoping to read, and that is Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. I love this book so much. 5 out of 5 stars. It was wonderful. So it was interesting because it was told in the format. So it seems like St. Francis was approached by this young woman. He was a bishop at the time. He was approached by this young woman who asked him, well, how do you live a devout life? And so he wrote this almost as a letter to her. So he's almost addressing her throughout the entire narrative. And it was very cool because a lot of medieval writers you read do not necessarily, they have stereotypic views of women. And not necessarily through their own fault, just because of how the society was formatted during that time. But with him, I just loved how nuanced he had an understanding of both men and women. And as if they both had the same value in life. And they were both extremely important and wonderful creatures in of themselves. And I just loved how he talked to her as if she were an equal. I really enjoyed that because you do not always see that in a lot of like historical medieval, or this one I think was written in around 1600 or late 1500s. You don't see that often in this time period in history. So similar to Imitation of Christ, it is very much about, how to live your life, how to be holy, how not to fall into certain sins, how to avoid temptation, how to be a better person, both in this world and in the next, obviously, if you go to heaven. Really interesting book. I loved it. It really gets you thinking. All these like theology books are more for getting you thinking. So I really enjoyed that book. So those are all the books that I read for March. I have to go read Shakespeare now forever. So this month will be all Shakespeare. I am starting with Henry VI. In fact, by the time you probably watch this, I will have finished at least part 1 and part 2. But really interesting, but I find the histories not as interesting as the comedies and tragedies. But have you read any of these books? What are you reading this month in April? We are currently in April. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.